I'm Sarah Chen, and I never imagined my wedding day would end with my own father being escorted out in handcuffs while a judge read my restraining order aloud to a courtroom full of our wedding guests. There I was, still in my white dress, holding Marcus's hand as the gavel came down and changed everything forever. What started as the happiest day of my life became the day I finally broke free from 26 years of control, manipulation, and fear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, I learned early that my father, Robert Chen, operated by one simple rule: his way or no way. Our house on Maple Street looked picture perfect from the outside, with its manicured desert landscaping and pristine white stucco walls. Inside, however, every decision, every choice, every breath I took was subject to Dad's approval. My mother, Linda, had long ago retreated into a shell of quiet compliance, nodding along to whatever Dad decreed while shooting me apologetic glances when he wasn't looking. Dad wasn't physically abusive in the traditional sense, but his control was absolute and suffocating. He chose my clothes until I was 16, monitored my friendships, and had strong opinions about everything from my hairstyle to my homework. When I showed interest in art classes, he steered me toward more practical subjects. When I wanted to learn guitar, he insisted on piano because it was more refined. Every rebellion was met with lectures about respect, family honor, and the sacrifices he'd made as a veteran to provide for us. The pattern continued through high school and college. Dad had mapped out my entire life. I would study education because teaching was stable and respectable. I would marry someone he approved of from a good family, and I would live close enough for regular family dinners where he could continue overseeing my choices. Any deviation from this plan was met with emotional manipulation, threats to cut off financial support, or silent treatments that could last for weeks. When I started my teaching career at Sunrise Elementary, I felt a small taste of independence for the first time. Working with third graders brought me genuine joy, and I was good at it. My classroom became my sanctuary, decorated with student artwork and filled with laughter. For 8 hours a day, I could be myself without someone questioning my every decision. But even this freedom came with strings attached. Dad insisted on reviewing my lesson plans, offered unsolicited advice about classroom management, and frequently reminded me that my teaching salary was only possible because of his support during college. My mother, Linda, bless her heart, had been worn down by decades of living under Dad's thumb. She'd once been vibrant and creative, painting watercolor landscapes that still hung in our guest bedroom. But somewhere along the way, she'd learned that keeping the peace meant keeping quiet. She communicated in subtle gestures and meaningful looks, never directly contradicting Dad but finding small ways to show her support for my independence. A $20 bill slipped into my purse, a favorite meal prepared after Dad had criticized my choices, or a gentle pat on the shoulder when I looked particularly defeated. Everything changed when I met Marcus Williams at a teacher training conference in downtown Phoenix. He was there presenting software solutions for educational institutions, and his genuine enthusiasm for helping students learn made him stand out from the typical tech crowd. Marcus had this wonderful quality of actually listening when people spoke, asking thoughtful questions, and treating everyone with equal respect regardless of their position or background. He was tall and lean with kind brown eyes and a smile that made me feel like I was the only person in the room. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours over coffee in the hotel lobby. We talked about everything from innovative teaching methods to our favorite hiking trails in the Arizona mountains. Marcus shared stories about growing up in a family that encouraged questions and celebrated individual achievements. His parents, Carol and Tom, had raised him and his sister to think critically, pursue their passions, and make their own mistakes. The concept was so foreign to my experience that I almost didn't believe such families existed. When Marcus asked for my number, I felt a flutter of excitement followed immediately by dread. Dad would want to investigate Marcus's background, meet his family, and probably run some kind of informal background check. I'd watched him intimidate previous boyfriends with intense questioning sessions that felt more like interrogations. Most guys didn't make it past the second family dinner, and honestly, I couldn't blame them. But Marcus was different. When I nervously explained my family's situation during our third date, he didn't run. Instead, he listened with genuine concern and asked thoughtful questions about how to navigate the relationship respectfully. He understood that my father's behavior wasn't normal, but he also recognized that confronting it directly would likely make things worse for me. We developed a strategy of gradual introduction, allowing Dad to get comfortable with Marcus's presence before revealing the depth of our relationship. The early months of dating were like living a double life. When Marcus and I were alone, I felt free to express opinions, make spontaneous decisions, and simply be myself. We'd drive up to Sedona for day trips, explore Phoenix's growing arts district, or spend hours talking about our dreams for the future. With him, I discovered parts of my personality that had been suppressed for years. I was funny, adventurous, and capable of making good decisions without constant oversight. But the moment I walked back into my family home, the familiar weight of surveillance descended. Dad peppered me with questions about where we'd been, what we'd talked about, and what Marcus's intentions were. He researched Marcus's employer, looked up his family's property records, and somehow obtained information about his college grades and employment history. The investigation felt invasive and embarrassing, but I'd learned that resistance only made Dad more suspicious and controlling. Marcus handled the scrutiny with remarkable grace. During family dinners, he answered Dad's probing questions politely while subtly redirecting conversations toward topics that showcased his stability and good character. He complimented Mom's cooking, showed genuine interest in Dad's military service, and demonstrated the kind of respectful behavior that even Dad couldn't criticize. Slowly, grudgingly, Dad began to approve of Marcus, though he made it clear that this approval came with expectations and conditions. The real test came when Marcus and I had been dating for 18 months and started talking seriously about marriage. I knew Dad would have opinions about the timeline, the proposal, the ring, the wedding planning, and probably our future living arrangements. What I didn't anticipate was how his need for control would escalate as he realized I was moving toward independence. The engagement itself was perfect. Marcus proposed during a sunset hike at Camelback Mountain, with the entire Phoenix Valley spread out below us. The ring was exactly what I would have chosen, a simple solitaire diamond on a classic gold band, elegant without being ostentatious. We were both crying and laughing as he slipped it onto my finger, and for a moment, everything felt possible and bright. But the joy was short-lived. When we announced our engagement at the next family dinner, Dad's first response wasn't congratulations but interrogation. Had we discussed finances? Where would we live? When was the wedding? How many children were we planning? What church would we attend? The questions came rapid fire, and I could see Marcus's jaw tighten as he realized this wasn't typical parental concern, but something much more invasive. The wedding planning process.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Became a battlefield disguised as family bonding. Dad had opinions about everything, and expressed them with the authority of someone paying for the entire event, which he wasn't. Marcus and I were covering most of the costs ourselves, with contributions from both sets of parents, but Dad acted as though his financial contribution gave him veto power over every decision. He disapproved of our choice of Desert Rose Country Club because it was too expensive and showed off. He wanted us to reconsider the guest list because some of my friends weren't appropriate influences. He had strong feelings about the menu, the music, the decorations, and even the officiant. When I suggested we might prefer a smaller, more intimate ceremony, he accused me of being selfish and not considering family expectations. The breaking point came during a particularly tense planning session 6 months before the wedding. We were discussing the ceremony program when Dad announced that he'd taken the liberty of rewriting our vows, because the ones we'd written weren't traditional enough. He pulled out a typed document and began reading words that bore no resemblance to our feelings or relationship. The vows he'd written focused heavily on obedience, traditional gender roles, and family obligations. Marcus and I exchanged shocked glances as Dad continued reading. These weren't vows that represented our partnership or our values. They were Dad's vision of what our marriage should be, complete with promises I had no intention of making and commitments that would essentially transfer Dad's control over me to Marcus. Mr. Chen, Marcus said carefully, we appreciate your input, but Sarah and I prefer the vows we've written together. They reflect our personal beliefs about marriage and partnership. Dad's face darkened in a way I recognized from childhood. Young man, I've been married for 30 years. I know what makes a marriage work, and it isn't this modern nonsense about equal partnerships. Marriage requires structure, hierarchy, and respect for traditional values. With all due respect, Marcus continued, his voice steady but firm, Sarah and I are building our marriage on mutual respect and shared decision-making. We value tradition, but we also believe in adapting those traditions to reflect our personal values. The argument that followed was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. Dad accused Marcus of undermining family values and turning me against my parents. He threatened to withdraw his financial contribution to the wedding and suggested that maybe we weren't ready for marriage if we couldn't accept guidance from our elders. Mom sat silent throughout the entire confrontation, her hands folded tightly in her lap. But something had shifted inside me during that argument. Watching Marcus stand up for our relationship with such calm dignity showed me what healthy boundaries looked like. For the first time in my life, I saw someone refuse to be intimidated by Dad's tactics while remaining respectful and composed. It was a revelation that would change everything. That night, I called my best friend Jessica Torres, who'd been my maid of honor and witness to years of family drama. "Jess," I said, my voice shaking, "I think my dad is going to try to control my wedding the same way he's controlled everything else in my life." Jessica had been waiting for this conversation for years. As a social worker, she'd recognized the patterns of emotional manipulation and control that I'd normalized as typical family dynamics. "Sarah," she said gently, "what your dad is doing isn't normal parental concern. It's controlling behavior, and it's only going to get worse after you're married unless you set boundaries now." The next few months were a delicate balance between wedding planning and family management. Marcus and I made decisions about our ceremony based on our preferences, then strategically presented them to Dad in ways that minimized conflict. We learned to phrase our choices as questions rather than announcements, letting Dad feel like he was providing guidance even when we'd already made our decisions. But Dad's behavior was escalating. He started showing up at my school unannounced, claiming he was just checking on me but clearly monitoring my daily routine. He called Marcus's workplace with vague questions about software services that were obviously pretexts for checking up on him. He began inserting himself into conversations with our wedding vendors, sometimes contradicting decisions Marcus and I had already made. The most troubling incident happened 3 months before the wedding. I came home from work to find Dad in my apartment, which he'd entered using the spare key Mom had given him years earlier for emergencies. He was going through my mail and claimed he was concerned about my financial management. The violation of privacy was stunning, but when I confronted him about it, he acted like I was being unreasonable for questioning his motives. That night, I made one of the hardest decisions of my life. I called David Thompson, an attorney who specialized in family law, and made an appointment to discuss my options. I wasn't sure what legal protections were available, but I knew Dad's behavior was crossing lines that felt dangerous and invasive. David listened to my story with professional calm, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Sarah, what you're describing is a pattern of controlling and potentially stalking behavior. The fact that he's escalating as your wedding approaches is concerning. Have you considered that his behavior might continue or worsen after you're married?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so focused on getting through the wedding that I hadn't fully considered what married life would look like with Dad continuing to monitor and control my choices. Would he expect regular reports on my marriage? Would he feel entitled to opinions about our home, our finances, our future children? The thought was terrifying. David explained my options, including the possibility of obtaining a restraining order if Dad's behavior continued to escalate. He emphasized that such measures were serious legal steps that would likely damage family relationships permanently. But he also stressed that everyone deserved to live free from harassment and control, even from family members. I left his office with a lot to think about, and a business card tucked into my purse like a secret weapon. I hoped I'd never need to use it, but knowing I had options felt empowering in a way I'd never experienced before. The final month before the wedding was increasingly tense. Dad had appointed himself as unofficial wedding coordinator, calling vendors to confirm details, and sometimes making changes without consulting us. When our florist called to verify that we wanted red roses instead of the white ones we'd chosen, I realized Dad was actively undermining our plans. The confrontation was inevitable. 2 weeks before the wedding, Marcus and I sat down with both my parents to establish clear boundaries about the final preparations. We explained that while we valued their input and support, we needed them to step back and allow us to manage the remaining details ourselves. Dad's response was explosive. He accused us of being ungrateful, disrespectful, and naive. He threatened to boycott the wedding entirely if we couldn't appreciate everything he'd done for us. The argument escalated quickly, with Dad making increasingly personal attacks on Marcus's character and our relationship. But this time something was different. Instead of shrinking back or apologizing to keep the peace, I found my voice. "Dad," I said, my hands shaking but my voice clear, "I love you, but your behavior has become controlling and inappropriate. Marcus and I are adults planning our own wedding, and we need you to respect our decisions." The silence that followed was deafening. Dad stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language, his face cycling through shock, anger, and something that looked almost like betrayal. Mom's eyes were wide with fear and what might have been admiration. "If that's how you feel," Dad said finally, his voice cold and measured, "then maybe you don't need family at all. Don't expect me to participate in a wedding where my own daughter treats me like a stranger." With that, he stormed out of the house, leaving Mom, Marcus, and me sitting in stunned silence. It was the first time in my life I'd directly confronted Dad's behavior, and while it felt terrifying, it also felt like breathing fresh air after being underwater for 26 years. The next morning, I called David Thompson again. David Thompson's office felt like a sanctuary when I walked in that Tuesday morning, still shaky from the confrontation with Dad the night before. The mahogany desk and law books lining the walls gave me a sense of official protection I'd never experienced. David listened as I recounted the latest incident, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "Sarah, your father's behavior is escalating in a predictable pattern," he explained, pulling out a legal pad. "The fact that he's threatening to sabotage your wedding unless you comply with his demands crosses into harassment territory. Combined with the unauthorized entry into your apartment and the surveillance of your daily activities, we have grounds for legal intervention." The words felt surreal. Legal intervention against my own father seemed like something that happened to other families, not mine. But as David outlined the documentation we'd need and the steps involved in obtaining a restraining order, I realized this might be the only way to protect my wedding day and my future marriage from Dad's increasing control. "The process typically takes about a week," David continued. "We'll file for a temporary restraining order first, which can be granted within 24 hours if the judge agrees there's immediate risk. Then we'll have a hearing where both parties can present their case, and the judge will decide whether to make it permanent." I thought about Mom, still sitting at the kitchen table when I'd left that morning, staring into her coffee cup with red-rimmed eyes. She'd barely spoken after Dad's dramatic exit, but I could see the wheels turning in her mind. For the first time in their 30-year marriage, she was watching someone stand up to her husband's controlling behavior. "What about my mother?" I asked David. "She's not part of this conflict, but she's caught in the middle. I don't want her to suffer because of my decision to pursue legal action." David nodded thoughtfully. "That's a common concern in family situations like this. The restraining order would specifically apply to your father's behavior toward you and Marcus. Your mother can maintain whatever relationship she chooses, though she may face pressure from your father to influence your decision." The next few days passed in a strange suspended reality. Marcus and I continued finalizing wedding details, while simultaneously gathering documentation for the restraining order. We printed text messages showing Dad's increasingly demanding tone, collected photos of him appearing at my workplace uninvited, and wrote detailed accounts of each incident that demonstrated the pattern of escalating control. Jessica proved invaluable during this process. As a social worker, she understood the legal requirements for documenting harassment and helped me organize our evidence in a clear chronological format. She also provided emotional support as I grappled with the enormity of taking legal action against my own father. "You're not destroying your family," she reminded me during one of our late-night phone calls. "You're protecting yourself from destructive behavior. There's a difference even though it doesn't always feel that way." Marcus's parents, Carol and Tom, were incredibly supportive throughout this ordeal. When I finally told them what was happening, Carol immediately offered to help with any wedding details Dad's absence might affect, while Tom quietly mentioned that he had contacts in law enforcement if we needed additional security advice. "Honey," Carol said, wrapping me in one of her warm hugs, "family should lift you up, not tear you down. What you're doing takes tremendous courage, and we're proud of you for standing up for yourself and your future." Their unconditional support highlighted the stark contrast between healthy family dynamics and what I'd grown up considering normal. In the Williams household, disagreements were discussed openly, individual choices were respected, and love wasn't conditional on compliance with parental expectations. Meanwhile, Dad's behavior continued to escalate in ways that validated our decision to seek legal protection. He showed up at Marcus's office building, claiming he needed to discuss important family matters, but clearly attempting to intimidate or manipulate him. When the receptionist asked Marcus if he wanted to see his visitor, Marcus politely declined and asked security to escort Dad from the premises. That evening, Dad called my cell phone 17 times in 2 hours, leaving increasingly agitated voicemails about respect, family loyalty, and the consequences of choosing outsiders over blood relatives. His messages grew more personal and hurtful, attacking everything from my career choices to my character. By the final message, his voice was shaking with rage, as he accused me of being an ungrateful daughter who was destroying the family. I saved every voicemail, knowing they would strengthen our case, while simultaneously feeling heartbroken that our relationship had deteriorated to this point. This wasn't the father who had taught me to ride a bike, or helped with school projects. This was someone whose need for control had overwhelmed any genuine love or concern for my well-being. The breakthrough came when Mom finally reached her breaking point. 3 days after Dad's office visit to Marcus, she called me at work during my lunch break. Her voice was different, stronger than I'd heard in years. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," she began, her words carefully measured. "Your father has been difficult since you stood up to him. He's been calling in sick to work, spending hours researching Marcus's family and background, and talking about ways to prevent this wedding from happening." My heart stopped. "What do you mean, prevent the wedding?" Mom was quiet for a long moment. "He's been contacting vendors, asking questions about cancellation policies. He called the country club yesterday, claiming there had been a family emergency, and the wedding might need to be postponed. I think he's planning something for Saturday." The revelation hit me like ice water. Dad wasn't just trying to control the wedding anymore, he was actively planning to sabotage it. The ceremony was only 4 days away, and we'd already confirmed final numbers with the caterer, sent programs to the printer, and coordinated with the photographer for timeline shots. "Mom, are you telling me he's going to try to cancel our wedding?" "I don't know exactly what he's planning," she admitted, "but he's been talking about teaching you a lesson about respect and family loyalty. He seems to think that if he disrupts the wedding enough, you'll realize you need to apologize and accept his authority." That afternoon, I called David Thompson with this new information. His response was immediate and decisive. "Sarah, we need to file that restraining order today. What your mother described suggests your father is planning to actively interfere with your wedding, which could constitute stalking and harassment. We can't wait for him to follow through on these threats." The paperwork was filed that evening, and by Friday morning, we had a temporary restraining order in place. The document legally prohibited Dad from contacting Marcus or me directly, coming within 500 feet of either of us, or interfering with our wedding ceremony or reception. Violating the order would result in immediate arrest. Having the legal protection felt like breathing freely for the first time in months, but I also knew it meant there was no going back. Dad would be served with the papers Friday afternoon, and his reaction would likely determine whether we had a peaceful wedding or a legal crisis. Friday evening, the night before our wedding, Marcus and I were at the rehearsal dinner when my phone rang. Mom's name appeared on the screen, and I stepped outside to take the call. "He knows about the restraining order," she said without preamble. "The sheriff served him the papers an hour ago. Sarah, I've never seen him this angry. He's talking about embarrassing you tomorrow, making sure everyone knows what kind of daughter would take legal action against her own father." My stomach dropped. What exactly did he say? "He said he's going to that wedding, whether you want him there or not, and if anyone tries to stop him, they'll see what a real man looks like when his family is threatened." I'm scared, Sarah. I've never seen him like this. I looked back through the restaurant window at our wedding party, laughing over dinner, at Marcus's warm smile, as he talked with our friends, at the life we'd built together that felt suddenly fragile and threatened. "Mom, are you safe? Do you need to stay somewhere else tonight?" "I'm going to my sister's house," she said. "I already packed a bag. But Sarah, I want you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. It took me 30 years to find the courage you showed this week." Her words brought tears to my eyes. For the first time in my adult life, my mother was openly supporting my decision to set boundaries with Dad, even though it meant confronting her own complicated marriage. That night, Marcus and I made the difficult decision to hire additional security for our wedding. Tom Williams had connected us with a retired police officer named Mike Rodriguez, who specialized in discreet event security. Mike would attend our ceremony in plain clothes, positioned to intervene if Dad attempted to disrupt the proceedings. "I know this isn't how you imagined your wedding day," Marcus said as we lay in bed that night, our hands intertwined in the darkness. "Are you sure you want to go through with this tomorrow? We could postpone until this legal situation is resolved." I squeezed his hand tighter. "No. I've spent 26 years letting my father control my choices through fear and manipulation. I'm not letting him control our wedding day too." Tomorrow we're getting married, surrounded by people who love and support us, and if he chooses to create drama, that's his decision, not ours. Marcus turned to face me in the dim light. I love you, Sarah Chen. Tomorrow you're going to be Sarah Williams, and we're going to build a life based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. Whatever happens with your father, that's not going to change. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect Arizona weather that makes you grateful to live in the desert. The sky was brilliant blue against the red rocks surrounding Desert Rose Country Club, and the temperature was ideal for an outdoor ceremony. As I sat in the bridal suite getting my hair and makeup done, surrounded by Jessica and Marcus's sister Katie, I felt a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. Jessica had taken charge of communication for the day, fielding calls from vendors and coordinating with our photographer. She'd also been in touch with Mike Rodriguez, who had arrived early to assess the venue layout and position
Himself strategically for the ceremony. Any word from your mom? Katie asked as the makeup artist applied my lipstick. She's coming, I replied, checking my phone for the third time that hour. She said she'd be here by noon for photos. I just hope she's okay. At 11:30, there was a soft knock on the bridal suite door. Jessica opened it to reveal Mom, looking elegant in her navy dress but with worry lines around her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. She was carrying a small wrapped box that she placed carefully on the dressing table. You look absolutely beautiful, she said, her voice thick with emotion as she took in my wedding dress. I brought you something. Inside the box was her pearl necklace, the one she'd worn for her own wedding 30 years ago. But beneath it was something I'd never seen before. A letter in Mom's handwriting. I wrote this last night, she explained. I wanted you to have it today regardless of what else happens. The letter was short but powerful. Mom wrote about watching me grow into a strong, independent woman despite the challenges in our family. She apologized for not protecting me from Dad's controlling behavior and expressed her admiration for my courage in setting boundaries. Most importantly, she wrote that she was proud to be my mother and that my happiness mattered more than keeping peace at any cost. By the time I finished reading, we were both crying and Jessica was frantically trying to preserve my makeup while handing us tissues. Mom, I whispered, thank you for supporting me. I know this is hard for you too. It's time I started standing up for what's right instead of what's easy, she replied, clasping the pearl necklace around my neck. Your father and I have our own problems to work out, but today is about you and Marcus starting your life together. At 1 o'clock, guests began arriving for the 2 o'clock ceremony. Marcus and I had chosen not to see each other before the wedding, so he was getting ready in a separate area with his groomsmen while I waited nervously in the bridal suite. Jessica kept checking with Mike Rodriguez, who reported that everything was proceeding normally with no sign of unwanted visitors. But at 1:45, as the wedding coordinator was organizing the processional lineup, Mike's voice came through Jessica's earpiece with an urgent update. We have a situation. Subject has arrived on property and is attempting to enter the ceremony area. I'm moving to intercept. Through the window of the bridal suite, I could see Dad striding across the country club parking lot, wearing his best suit and walking with the determined pace I recognized from childhood confrontations. Despite the restraining order, despite everything that had happened this week, he was here to assert his authority over my wedding day. My hands started shaking as I watched Mike Rodriguez approach Dad near the entrance to the ceremony area. Even from a distance, I could see Dad's animated gestures and aggressive body language as he apparently argued with Mike about his right to attend his daughter's wedding. What do we do? Katie asked, looking between Jessica and me with worried eyes. Jessica was already on her phone with David Thompson, who was standing by for exactly this scenario. David, he's here, Mike has intercepted him, but he's arguing that the restraining order doesn't apply to a public venue. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Guests were seated, the string quartet was playing, and our officiant was in position, but the bride was watching her father being arrested through a window. Because that's what was happening. Mike Rodriguez had called for backup when Dad refused to leave voluntarily, and 2 police cars were now pulling into the country club parking lot. Sarah, Jessica said gently, we can delay the ceremony if you need time to process this. I took a deep breath, looking at myself in the mirror one final time. The woman staring back at me was wearing my grandmother's pearls and my mother's necklace, but she was nobody's victim. She was someone who had found the courage to protect herself and her future, even when it meant making the hardest choice of her life. No, I said firmly. We're getting married right now exactly as planned.
If my father chooses to get arrested rather than respect my boundaries, that's his decision. But it's not going to ruin my wedding day. As we lined up for the processional, I could see Marcus waiting at the altar, his face lighting up when he spotted me at the entrance to the ceremony area. 200 yards away, Dad was being placed in handcuffs beside a police car, but I kept my eyes focused on the man I was about to marry and the future we were creating together. The string quartet began playing Pachelbel's Canon in D, and I started walking down the aisle on Tom Williams' arm, since Marcus's father had graciously offered to escort me when it became clear Dad wouldn't be participating. With each step, I felt lighter and more certain that I was exactly where I belonged. But as we reached the halfway point of my walk down the aisle, I heard Dad's voice shouting from the parking lot, his words carrying across the desert air for all our guests to hear. This is what happens when children disrespect their parents. She's making the biggest mistake of her life. A murmur went through the crowd of guests, heads turning toward the commotion, but Marcus never looked away from me. His steady gaze and calm smile reminded me that this moment was ours, regardless of the chaos Dad was creating. The ceremony continued, despite the distraction, with our officiant skillfully redirecting attention back to the vows and rings. But just as Marcus was placing my wedding ring on my finger, Dad's voice rose again from the parking lot. I demand to speak to my daughter. This is a family matter, and no court has the right to interfere. This time, the police officer's response was audible to our guests. Sir, you're in violation of a restraining order. You have the right to remain silent. As Dad was read his Miranda rights in the background, Marcus and I exchanged rings and promised to love and support each other through all of life's challenges. The irony wasn't lost on me that the man who had controlled every aspect of my life was being arrested for trying to control my wedding while I was promising to enter a partnership based on mutual respect and freedom. You may kiss the bride, our officiant announced, and as Marcus's lips met mine, I heard the police car doors slam in the distance. We were married, Dad was in custody, and our real life together was finally beginning. The reception was supposed to be a celebration, but instead it felt like we were hosting a wake for a relationship that had died in handcuffs. Marcus and I tried to maintain normal wedding festivities, cutting the cake and sharing our first dance while guests whispered about the dramatic arrest they'd just witnessed. Everyone was trying to pretend nothing unusual had happened, but the elephant in the room was impossible to ignore. Jessica had taken charge of damage control, quietly explaining to confused relatives that there had been a family dispute and that Dad had violated a court order by attending against my wishes. Most guests were supportive once they understood the situation, but I could see the judgment in some faces, the unspoken questions about what kind of daughter would have her own father arrested on her wedding day. Marcus's aunt pulled me aside during the cocktail hour, her face creased with concern. Honey, I know family relationships can be complicated, but maybe there was another way to handle this situation. Families should stick together, especially during important moments like weddings. Her words stung because they echoed the guilt I was already feeling. Despite everything Dad had done, despite the months of escalating control and manipulation, part of me wondered if I could have found a different solution. But then I remembered his threatening voicemails, his unauthorized entry into my apartment, and his promise to sabotage my wedding, and I knew that legal intervention had been the only option left. Tom Williams must have noticed my distress, because he appeared at my elbow with a gentle smile and a glass of champagne. Sarah, you did exactly what you needed to do to protect yourself and your marriage. Don't let anyone make you second-guess that decision. The evening continued with forced normalcy until around 9 o'clock, when David Thompson appeared at the reception with an expression that told me our legal drama was far from over. He found Marcus and me on the dance floor, and discreetly asked if we could speak privately. Your father has been released on his own recognizance. David explained once we'd stepped into a quiet corner of the country club. He was charged with violating the restraining order, but the judge allowed him to post bail. However, there's been a development that complicates things. My stomach dropped. What kind of development? He's filed a counter-petition claiming that the restraining order was obtained under false pretenses. He's alleging that you and Marcus conspired to manipulate the legal system in order to exclude him from your wedding for personal reasons rather than legitimate safety concerns. Marcus's jaw tightened. That's ridiculous. We have documentation of months of escalating harassment and control. I know, and our evidence is strong, David assured us. But his counter-petition means we'll need to appear in court Monday morning for a full hearing. The judge will review all evidence from both sides and make a determination about whether the restraining order should remain in place permanently. The news cast a shadow over what should have been the happiest night of our lives. Instead of enjoying our wedding reception, Marcus and I found ourselves discussing legal strategy and preparing for a court battle with my own father. The honeymoon we'd planned in Sedona would have to be postponed until this legal mess was resolved. Mom appeared nervous and apologetic when she approached us later that evening. She'd stayed for the entire reception, trying to maintain some semblance of normal family support, but I could see the strain in her eyes. "I'm so sorry this happened on your wedding day," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never imagined he would actually show up after being served with the restraining order." "Mom, none of this is your fault," I assured her. "You warned us he was planning something, which allowed us to be prepared." She nodded but looked troubled. "Sarah, I need to tell you something else. Your father called me from jail tonight. He's convinced that Marcus has somehow brainwashed you against your family. He's talking about proving in court that this whole situation is Marcus's fault, not his." The accusation was so absurd it would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. Dad's inability to accept responsibility for his own behavior was now extending to blaming my husband for my decision to set boundaries. The fact that he still couldn't see his actions as problematic spoke to how deep his need for control really went. Sunday was spent in preparation for Monday's court hearing. David Thompson met with us at his office to review our evidence and prepare our testimony. We organized months of documentation showing Dad's pattern of escalating behavior, from the unauthorized apartment entry to the workplace surveillance to the threatening voicemails. The key to this hearing is demonstrating that your father's behavior represents a genuine threat to your safety and well-being. David explained, "The judge needs to see that this isn't just a family disagreement, but a pattern of harassment that required legal intervention." Marcus and I spent hours writing detailed statements about each incident, trying to capture not just what Dad had done, but how his actions had affected our daily lives and our sense of security. It was emotionally exhausting to relive months of manipulation and control, but it was also empowering to see the pattern laid out clearly on paper. Jessica offered to testify as a character witness, explaining her professional observations about the unhealthy family dynamics she'd witnessed over the years. As a social worker, her testimony would carry weight with the judge about the difference between normal parental concern and controlling behavior. That evening, Mom called to let me know that Dad had hired his own attorney, a man named Richard Sterling, who apparently specialized in family law and had a reputation for aggressive tactics. She'd overheard Dad on the phone describing me as an ungrateful daughter who had been manipulated by outside influences into betraying her family. "He's telling people that Marcus has isolated you from your family and convinced you to pursue legal action as a way of controlling the family narrative," Mom explained. "I don't think he truly believes that, but his lawyer seems to think it's a viable defense strategy." The irony was staggering. Dad was accusing Marcus of the exact controlling behavior that he himself had exhibited for my entire life. The projection was so complete that I wondered if Dad had any self-awareness about his own actions at all. Monday morning arrived gray and overcast, with storm clouds gathering over the Phoenix Valley in a way that felt ominous. Marcus and I dressed carefully for court, knowing that our appearance and demeanor would be scrutinized by the judge. We arrived at the Maricopa County Courthouse 30 minutes early, wanting time to settle our nerves and review our testimony one final time. The courthouse was busy with the typical Monday morning rush of legal proceedings. Lawyers in expensive suits hurried through the hallways carrying briefcases, while families dealing with various legal crises sat on benches looking anxious and overwhelmed. Marcus and I found seats outside Judge Patricia Martinez's courtroom and waited for our case to be called. At 9:45, Dad arrived with his attorney Richard Sterling, a tall man with silver hair and an expensive suit who looked like he belonged in a corporate boardroom rather than a family court. Dad was wearing his best navy suit and had clearly made an effort to appear respectable and sympathetic. When he saw Marcus and me sitting across the hallway, his expression hardened, but he didn't attempt to approach or communicate. Sterling, however, made a point of introducing himself to David Thompson with the kind of professional courtesy that felt more like sizing up the opposition. The brief conversation between the two lawyers was polite but tense, with each clearly trying to assess the other's strategy and confidence level. Judge Patricia Martinez called our case at 10:15. She was a middle-aged Hispanic woman, with kind but serious eyes and an air of no-nonsense authority that immediately commanded respect. Her courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with about 30 seats for observers and a raised bench that gave her a clear view of all proceedings. David Thompson presented our case first, methodically walking through the timeline of Dad's escalating behavior. He submitted our documentation as evidence, including photographs of Dad at my workplace, transcripts of his threatening voicemails, and my detailed account of the unauthorized apartment entry. Your Honor, this case represents a clear pattern of stalking and harassment that escalated over several months. David explained. Ms. Chen repeatedly attempted to address her father's controlling behavior through normal family communication, but Mr. Chen's response was to increase his surveillance and intimidation tactics. When David called me to testify, my hands were shaking as I approached the witness stand. Judge Martinez administered the oath, and I promised to tell the truth while looking directly at Dad, who was staring at me with an expression of hurt and betrayal. Williams, David began, using my new married name for the first time in court. Can you describe your father's behavior in the months leading up to your wedding? I took a deep breath and began recounting the story, starting with Dad's increasing control over wedding decisions and escalating to his threats to sabotage the ceremony. My voice remained steady, as I described finding him in my apartment without permission, and his pattern of showing up at my workplace unannounced. How did these incidents make you feel? David asked. Scared and violated, I answered honestly. I felt like I had no privacy or autonomy. Every decision I made was subject to my father's approval, and when I tried to set boundaries, his behavior became more invasive and threatening. Richard Sterling's cross-examination was aggressive, but not particularly effective. He tried to characterize my testimony as exaggerated complaints about normal parental concern, suggesting that I was being overly sensitive to Dad's attempts to stay involved in my life. Isn't it true, Miss Williams, that your father was simply trying to be helpful with your wedding planning? Sterling asked. No, that's not true, I replied firmly. Helpful would have been offering suggestions and respecting our decisions. My father was attempting to control every aspect of our wedding, and when we declined his input, he threatened to sabotage the ceremony. Sterling then tried to suggest that Marcus had influenced my decision to seek legal protection, painting him as a manipulative outsider who had driven a wedge between father and daughter. The strategy was transparent and insulting, but I could see how it might resonate with judges who believed in traditional family hierarchies. Isn't it true that before you met your husband, you had a close relationship with your father? Sterling continued. I had a relationship with my father that I thought was normal, because I didn't know any different, I answered. But it was based on my compliance with his control, not on mutual respect or genuine affection. When Marcus testified, he was calm and articulate, describing Dad's inappropriate behavior without showing anger or defensiveness. His professional demeanor and respectful responses seemed to undermine Sterling's attempts to portray him as a manipulative influence. Mr. Williams, how would you characterize your relationship with your father-in-law prior to these recent events? David asked. I tried very hard to be respectful and accommodating, Marcus replied. I understood that Mr. Chen was protective of his daughter, and I wanted to build a positive relationship with him. However, his behavior went far beyond normal parental concern, into territory that felt controlling and inappropriate. Sterling's cross-examination of Marcus focused on his role in encouraging me to seek legal protection, trying to suggest that he had pushed me toward confrontation rather than family reconciliation. Mr. Williams, didn't you encourage your wife to pursue a restraining order against her father? I supported my wife's decision to protect herself from harassment, Marcus answered carefully. The choice to seek legal protection was entirely hers, based on months of escalating behavior that made her feel unsafe. The most powerful testimony came from Jessica, whose professional background gave her observations significant weight. As a social worker, she was able to explain the difference between healthy family dynamics and controlling behavior in terms that clearly resonated with Judge Martinez. In my professional opinion, Mr. Chen's behavior exhibits classic patterns of emotional abuse and control, Jessica testified. The escalation of surveillance, threats and attempts to isolate Sarah from her support system are red flags that indicate a dangerous level of possessiveness. Sterling tried to discredit Jessica's testimony by suggesting she was biased as my friend, but her professional credentials and calm demeanor made his attacks seem petty and desperate. When Dad finally took the stand to defend himself, the contrast with our composed testimony was striking. He was emotional and defensive, frequently interrupting Sterling's questions to launch into speeches about family loyalty and respect. His inability to acknowledge any wrongdoing in his behavior made him appear unreasonable and potentially unstable. Mr. Chen, can you explain your presence at your daughter's workplace on multiple occasions? Sterling asked. I was concerned about her welfare, Dad replied, his voice rising. As her father, I have a right to check on my daughter's well-being. There's nothing wrong with a parent showing interest in their child's life. And the incident at her apartment, I used the key her mother gave me for emergencies because I was worried about her financial decisions. Someone needs to look out for her interests, since she clearly can't manage her own affairs. His responses demonstrated exactly the controlling mindset that had led to this legal proceeding. Even under oath in a courtroom, Dad couldn't see his behavior as anything other than appropriate parental concern. The lack of self-awareness was both sad and frightening. When David cross-examined Dad, the questioning was methodical and devastating. He walked through each incident, asking Dad to explain his actions and motivations in a way that highlighted the controlling nature of his behavior. Mr. Chen, when your daughter asked you to respect her wedding planning decisions, what was your response? I told her she was making mistakes and needed guidance from someone with more experience. And when she declined your guidance, I tried to help her understand that her choices were wrong and would lead to problems in her marriage. By threatening to sabotage her wedding, I never threatened anything. I simply wanted her to understand the consequences of disrespecting her family. The exchange continued for 20 minutes, with Dad consistently failing to see how his responses demonstrated the controlling behavior we'd documented. His insistence that he was acting in my best interests, even when those actions violated my explicit wishes, painted a clear picture of someone who couldn't respect boundaries or accept that his adult daughter had the right to make her own decisions. Judge Martinez called a brief recess after Dad's testimony, during which Sterling huddled with his client in urgent whispered conversation. I could see Dad's face growing more flushed and agitated as his lawyer apparently explained how poorly his testimony had gone. When court reconvened, Sterling called Mom as a character witness for Dad, clearly hoping that her testimony would humanize him and suggest that his behavior was simply protective rather than controlling. But Mom's testimony took an unexpected turn that surprised everyone in the courtroom. Mrs. Chen, would you describe your husband as a loving father? Sterling asked. Mom was quiet for a long moment, looking at Dad and then at me before answering. My husband loves Sarah in his own way, but his love comes with conditions and expectations that aren't always healthy. Sterling looked surprised by her response and tried to redirect. But he's always been concerned about Sarah's welfare, hasn't he? Yes, but his concern often manifests as control, Mom replied, her voice growing stronger. I've watched him monitor and direct every aspect of Sarah's life for 26 years. What happened at the wedding was just the culmination of a pattern that has been building for decades. The courtroom was completely silent as Mom continued speaking, finally giving voice to observations she'd kept to herself for 30 years of marriage. I love my husband, but I've also enabled his controlling behavior by staying quiet when I should have spoken up. Watching Sarah find the courage to set boundaries has made me realize how unhealthy our family dynamics have become. Sterling quickly ended his questioning, realizing that Mom's testimony was undermining rather than supporting Dad's case. When David declined to cross-examine, Judge Martinez called for closing arguments. David's closing was straightforward and compelling, summarizing the evidence and emphasizing the pattern of escalating behavior that culminated in Dad's arrest at our wedding. He emphasized that restraining orders weren't punishment but protection, designed to prevent further harassment and allow families to heal. Sterling's closing argument was passionate but ultimately unconvincing. He portrayed Dad as a concerned father, whose traditional values had been misunderstood by a generation that didn't respect family authority. The argument might have resonated 50 years ago, but in today's legal climate, it sounded outdated and paternalistic. Judge Martinez deliberated for only 15 minutes before returning to deliver her verdict. The brevity of her deliberation suggested that our evidence had been compelling and Dad's defense inadequate. I've reviewed all evidence and testimony presented today, she began, her voice clear and authoritative. While I understand that family relationships can be complex and emotional, the court's responsibility is to protect individuals from harassment and stalking, regardless of the family relationships involved. She paused, looking directly at Dad before continuing. Mr. Chen, your behavior as documented and testified to today represents a clear pattern of controlling and invasive conduct that escalated over several months.
Your inability to acknowledge the inappropriate nature of your actions, even under oath, suggests that this behavior would likely continue without legal intervention. Dad's face was growing redder with each word, and I could see his hands clenching and unclenching in his lap. Furthermore, your violation of the temporary restraining order by attending your daughter's wedding, despite being legally prohibited, demonstrates a willful disregard for court authority and your daughter's clearly expressed wishes. Judge Martinez picked up her gavel, and I held my breath for her final ruling. The restraining order is hereby made permanent. Chen, you are prohibited from contacting Sarah Williams or Marcus Williams directly or indirectly, from coming within 500 feet of either party, and from interfering with their employment, residence, or daily activities. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and prosecution. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the courtroom, officially ending my father's legal authority to control my life. Dad stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "This is not over," he said loudly, pointing at Marcus and me. "You'll regret the day you chose strangers over family." Judge Martinez's voice cut through his outburst like a knife. "Mr. Chen, you are dangerously close to violating the restraining order I just issued. I suggest you leave this courtroom immediately and refrain from any further contact with the protected parties." As Dad stormed out of the courtroom, with Sterling hurrying behind him, I felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and liberation that was almost overwhelming. The legal battle was over, the restraining order was permanent, and Marcus and I were finally free to build our marriage without the constant threat of interference and control. But as we gathered our papers and prepared to leave the courthouse, I realized that while we'd won the legal battle, the emotional consequences of this confrontation would likely last much longer. I'd gained my freedom, but I'd also lost my father, and that reality was both empowering and heartbreaking. Walking out of that courthouse felt like emerging from an underground tunnel into brilliant sunlight. The weight I'd carried for 26 years had been officially lifted by Judge Martinez's gavel, but the emotional reckoning was just beginning. Marcus took my hand
As we descended the courthouse steps, and I noticed my fingers were trembling despite the warm Arizona afternoon, David Thompson walked with us to the parking garage, briefing us on what the permanent restraining order meant in practical terms. Dad was legally prohibited from any contact, direct or indirect, which included social media, emails, phone calls, or messages through third parties. He couldn't come to our home, our workplaces, or any public events where he knew we'd be present. Violation would result in immediate arrest and criminal charges. The order doesn't expire unless you petition to have it removed, David explained as we reached our cars. Given your father's behavior in court today, I'd recommend keeping it in place indefinitely. People who refuse to acknowledge their controlling behavior rarely change without serious intervention. The ride home was quiet, both Marcus and I processing what had just happened. We'd won a decisive legal victory, but it felt more like surviving a disaster than celebrating a triumph. The man who had taught me to read and helped me with school projects was now legally classified as a threat to my safety. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Our apartment felt like a sanctuary when we finally walked through the door. Marcus immediately started making tea while I collapsed onto our couch, still wearing the conservative dress I'd chosen for court. The normalcy of our living room, with its mismatched furniture and wedding photos from just 3 days ago, seemed surreal after the formal courtroom drama. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked, settling beside me with 2 steaming mugs. "Empty," I admitted. "Like I should be relieved or happy, but mostly I just feel sad." "Is that normal?" Marcus wrapped his arm around my shoulders. "I think everything you're feeling is normal. You just had to take legal action against your own father to protect yourself. Even when it's necessary, that's going to be complicated emotionally." The phone started ringing within an hour of our return home. Word of the court hearing had spread through our extended family, and everyone seemed to have opinions about what had transpired. Some relatives were supportive, expressing admiration for my courage in standing up to Dad's controlling behavior. Others were critical, suggesting that family problems should be resolved privately rather than through the legal system. Marcus fielded most of the calls while I tried to decompress from the morning's events. I could hear him patiently explaining our side of the story to various family members, maintaining his calm tone even when the conversations became heated. His steady support during this entire ordeal had been my anchor, and I felt grateful beyond words to have a partner who understood the difference between healthy family relationships and toxic control. My Aunt Patricia called around 4 o'clock, her voice tight with disapproval. She'd always been Dad's biggest supporter, sharing his traditional views about family hierarchy and parental authority. Marcus handed me the phone with a warning look that suggested this conversation wouldn't be pleasant. "Sarah, I can't believe what I'm hearing about this court situation," she began without preamble. "Your father is devastated. He's been crying for hours, talking about how his own daughter has turned against him. How could you humiliate him like this in front of a judge?" Her words triggered a familiar surge of guilt that I'd been conditioned to feel whenever someone criticized my choices. For a moment I wavered, wondering if I'd been too harsh and seeking legal protection. But then I remembered Dad's threatening voicemails, his unauthorized entry into my apartment, and his promise to sabotage my wedding. "Aunt Patricia, I understand this is difficult for everyone," I replied carefully. But Dad's behavior had become frightening and invasive. I tried to address it through normal family communication for months, but he wouldn't respect any boundaries I set. "Boundaries," she scoffed. "In my day, children respected their parents instead of running to lawyers every time they disagreed with family decisions. Your father loves you, Sarah. Everything he did was out of concern for your welfare." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Patricia alternately guilt-tripping me about Dad's emotional state and lecturing me about family loyalty. By the time I hung up, I felt emotionally drained, and second-guessing my decisions all over again. Marcus found me sitting on our bedroom floor, surrounded by childhood photos I'd pulled from a storage box. Pictures of Dad teaching me to ride a bike, helping with science fair projects, cheering at my high school graduation. The man in these photos looked loving and proud, nothing like the angry, controlling person who'd been escorted out of our wedding in handcuffs. "I keep wondering if there was another way," I confessed as Marcus sat down beside me. "Maybe if I'd been more patient or found better ways to communicate with him, we could have avoided all this legal drama." Marcus picked up one of the photos, a picture of Dad and me at a father-daughter dance when I was 12. "Sarah, look at this photo. Really look at it. What do you remember about that night?" I studied the image, remembering how excited I'd been about the dance and the special dress Mom had bought for the occasion. But other memories surfaced too: the lecture Dad had given me in the car about appropriate behavior, his criticism of my dancing style, and his insistence on approving every conversation I had with other fathers and daughters at the event. Even then, he was controlling everything, I realized aloud. I was so focused on making him proud that I didn't notice how he managed every aspect of my experience. Marcus nodded gently. "The love was real, but it came with conditions and control. That pattern started long before your wedding, and it would have continued after your marriage if you hadn't taken action to stop it." Over the next few weeks, the full impact of the restraining order became apparent in ways both liberating and painful. For the first time in my adult life, I could make decisions without worrying about Dad's reaction. I could plan weekend trips without elaborate explanations, pursue friendships he might disapprove of, and express opinions that differed from his worldview. But the freedom came with an unexpected cost. Mom was caught in an impossible position between her husband and her daughter, trying to maintain relationships with both of us while respecting the legal boundaries. She started calling more frequently, but our conversations were strained and careful, both of us avoiding topics that might lead to discussions about Dad. 3 weeks after the court hearing, Mom asked to meet me for lunch at a small cafe in Central Phoenix. She looked exhausted when she arrived, with dark circles under her eyes and a hesitant manner that suggested she had something difficult to discuss. "Your father is struggling," she began once we'd ordered our meals. "He's been off work since the court hearing, spending most of his time either sleeping or pacing around the house. He keeps talking about how his own daughter has destroyed the family." The news made my chest tighten with a familiar mixture of guilt and frustration. Part of me wanted to fix Dad's pain, to find some way to restore our relationship and make everything go back to normal. But I knew that normal had never been healthy, and that any reconciliation would require Dad to acknowledge his controlling behavior and commit to real change. "Mom, I'm sorry he's hurting, but I can't be responsible for his emotional state," I said carefully. "He chose to violate the restraining order by coming to my wedding. He chose to refuse therapy or family counseling when I suggested it months ago. These are consequences of his own decisions." Mom nodded sadly. "I know you're right. I've been thinking a lot about our family dynamics over the years, and I'm starting to see patterns I ignored for too long. Your father's need to control everything has affected all of us, including me." She paused, stirring her coffee absently. "I've been considering couples counseling, but your father refuses to participate. He says therapists are biased against traditional family values, and that our problems are caused by outside influences, not his behavior. The lunch continued with Mom sharing her own struggles to establish independence within her marriage. She'd started setting small boundaries with Dad, like making plans with friends without seeking his approval and expressing her own opinions during family discussions. His reaction had been predictably negative, with increased criticism and attempts to reassert control over her daily activities. "I'm proud of you for standing up to him," Mom admitted as we prepared to leave. "It took courage I never had when I was your age. Maybe it's not too late for me to find some of that courage too." Her words stayed with me for days afterward. I'd been so focused on my own relationship with Dad that I hadn't fully considered how his controlling behavior had affected Mom's autonomy and self-expression over the years. The restraining order had protected Marcus and me, but Mom was still living with the daily reality of Dad's need to control everything around him. Marcus and I finally took our delayed honeymoon 6 weeks after the wedding, driving up to Sedona for a long weekend among the Red Rocks. The resort was peaceful and beautiful, with hiking trails that led to stunning vistas and a spa that helped us both decompress from the legal stress we'd been carrying. On our last evening there, as we watched the sunset paint the canyon walls in brilliant oranges and purples, Marcus brought up a conversation we'd been avoiding. "Have you thought about what happens if your father eventually wants to reconcile?" he asked. "The restraining order doesn't have to be permanent if he genuinely changes his behavior and seeks appropriate help." I'd been wrestling with this question for weeks. Part of me missed having a father, missed the good memories we'd shared before his control became so overwhelming. But I also knew that any reconciliation would need to be based on genuine change, not just his promises to do better. "I think I'd be open to family therapy if he was willing to participate honestly," I said slowly. "But he'd need to acknowledge that his behavior was controlling and inappropriate, and commit to real change. I can't go back to a relationship where my autonomy is constantly under threat." Marcus took my hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on my palm. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you. But I also want you to know that you don't owe him a relationship just because he's your father. Sometimes the healthiest choice is to accept that some relationships can't be repaired." The conversation continued as we watched stars emerge in the clear desert sky. We talked about the family we wanted to create together, built on mutual respect and healthy communication rather than control and manipulation. We discussed how we'd handle future challenges and disagreements, using the tools we'd learned through this difficult experience. 6 months after the court hearing, I received an unexpected phone call that would test my resolve in ways I hadn't anticipated. Mom called early on a Saturday morning, her voice thick with tears and barely controlled emotion. "Sarah, your father has had a heart attack," she said without preamble. "He's in the hospital, and the doctors aren't sure if he's going to make it through the next 24 hours. The news hit me like a physical blow. Despite everything that had happened, despite the restraining order and the legal battles, he was still my father. The thought of him dying while we were estranged felt unbearable, but I also knew that rushing to his bedside might not be legally permissible or emotionally healthy. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I managed. What do the doctors say about his condition?" "Massive heart attack. They're doing everything they can, but he's in critical condition." "Sarah, I know about the restraining order, but he's been asking for you. He keeps saying he wants to talk to you before it's too late." The next few hours were an emotional whirlwind of phone calls with David Thompson about the legal implications of hospital visits, conversations with Marcus about what felt right morally versus legally, and internal wrestling with my own conflicted feelings about Dad's potential death. David explained that I could petition the court for a temporary modification of the restraining order that would allow supervised hospital visits in the event of a life-threatening medical emergency. The process would take several hours, but could be expedited given the circumstances. Marcus and I drove to the courthouse that afternoon to file the necessary paperwork. Judge Martinez was available for emergency hearings, and agreed to hear our petition immediately. She granted a temporary modification that would allow me to visit Dad in the hospital under specific conditions. Visits had to be supervised by medical staff, limited to 30 minutes, and focused solely on the medical emergency rather than attempts to resolve our underlying conflict. St. Joseph's Hospital felt sterile and intimidating as Marcus and I walked through the cardiac intensive care unit. Mom met us at the nurse's station, looking exhausted and grateful that I'd come despite everything that had happened between our families. "He's been sedated most of the day, but he's conscious now," she explained as we walked toward his room. The doctors say the next 48 hours will be critical for determining if there's been permanent damage. Seeing Dad in that hospital bed was shocking. He looked smaller and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him, connected to machines that monitored his heart rhythm and oxygen levels. His face was pale and drawn, making him appear much older than his 58 years. When he saw me enter the room, his eyes filled with tears. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed earlier. "I didn't think you'd come. Mom said you were asking for me," I replied, staying near the door while Marcus waited in the hallway to respect our family's privacy. Dad struggled to sit up straighter, wincing with the effort. "I've been thinking about everything that happened. The wedding, the court hearing, all of it. I know you think I was trying to control you, but I was just trying to protect you." His words triggered a familiar frustration, even in this medical crisis. Dad still couldn't acknowledge that his behavior had been inappropriate, framing it instead as protective rather than controlling. But looking at him hooked up to machines, fighting for his life, I found myself feeling more sad than angry. "Dad, I know you love me in your own way," I said carefully, "but your protection felt like control to me. I needed space to make my own decisions and my own mistakes." We talked for 20 minutes, with Dad gradually becoming more emotional as he tried to explain his perspective. He talked about his own father, who had been distant and uninvolved, and how he'd tried to be the opposite by staying actively engaged in my life. He couldn't seem to understand that there was a middle ground between neglect and control. "I just want my daughter back," he said finally, tears streaming down his face. "I don't want to die knowing you hate me." "I don't hate you, Dad," I replied honestly. "But I can't go back to the way things were. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be based on respect for my autonomy and my marriage." The conversation ended when Dad became too tired to continue, but I left the hospital feeling emotionally drained and conflicted. Seeing him so vulnerable had reminded me of the loving father he'd been during parts of my childhood, but it hadn't erased the months of controlling behavior that had led to our legal confrontation. Dad survived the heart attack and gradually recovered over the following weeks, though his doctors warned that his cardiac function had been permanently compromised. The medical crisis had given us an opportunity to communicate directly for the first time since the courthouse confrontation, but it hadn't resolved the fundamental issues in our relationship. Mom later told me that Dad's brush with death had prompted some self-reflection about his behavior and priorities. He'd started reading books about healthy family relationships, and had even expressed interest in individual therapy, though he hadn't taken concrete steps to pursue it. The hospital visits continued weekly during Dad's recovery period, always supervised and focused on his medical progress, rather than our personal conflict. Gradually we developed a new pattern of interaction that felt safer and more boundaried than our previous relationship. Dad seemed to understand that dramatic gestures or emotional manipulation wouldn't rebuild our connection. 8 months after the heart attack, Dad finally took the step I'd been hoping for since our legal battle began. He called Mom to ask if I'd be willing to participate in family therapy with a counselor who specialized in control issues and family dysfunction. He'd found a therapist named Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who had experience helping families rebuild relationships after legal interventions. The decision to pursue family therapy felt both hopeful and terrifying. Part of me wanted to believe that Dad was genuinely committed to changing his behavior, while another part worried that this was another attempt to manipulate me into resuming our previous relationship dynamic. Marcus and I discussed the therapy option extensively, including the potential risks and benefits of reopening communication with Dad in a supervised setting. We decided that I would participate in individual sessions with Dr. Martinez first, to establish my own therapeutic goals and boundaries before engaging in family sessions. Dr. Martinez was a warm, intelligent woman who understood the complexities of family relationships, damaged by control and manipulation. During our individual sessions, she helped me articulate what genuine change would look like from Dad, and what kinds of boundaries I needed to maintain for my own emotional safety. "Reconciliation doesn't mean returning to previous relationship patterns," she explained during one session. "It means creating entirely new ways of interacting that respect everyone's autonomy and well-being." The first family therapy session was awkward and tense, with Dad clearly struggling to participate without trying to control the narrative. Dr. Martinez was skilled at redirecting his attempts to justify his past behavior, and focusing instead on present-moment communication and future goals. Over several months of weekly sessions, Dad gradually began to acknowledge how his behavior had affected me and our family.
It wasn't easy for him to admit that his actions had been controlling rather than protective, but the heart attack seemed to have created some genuine motivation for self-reflection and change. The breakthrough came during a session where Dad finally said the words I'd been waiting to hear for decades. "Sarah, I'm sorry. My behavior was wrong, and it hurt you. I want to learn how to be a better father." The apology felt genuine in a way his previous attempts at reconciliation had not. There were no qualifications or justifications, no attempts to blame outside influences or minimize his actions. For the first time, Dad was taking full responsibility for the controlling behavior that had damaged our relationship. Rebuilding trust was a slow process that required consistent effort from both of us. Dad had to learn new ways of expressing concern and offering support that didn't involve monitoring or controlling my choices. I had to learn how to share information about my life without feeling like I was giving him ammunition to use against me. The restraining order remained in place during the early months of therapy, providing legal protection while we worked on rebuilding our emotional connection. Eventually, after 9 months of consistent progress in therapy, I petitioned the court to modify the order to allow supervised visits and phone calls. Judge Martinez reviewed our progress reports from Dr. Martinez and agreed to the modification, though she kept the core protections in place. Dad was still prohibited from showing up at my home or workplace unannounced, and any violation would result in immediate reinstatement of the full restraining order. 2 years after our wedding day confrontation, Marcus and I hosted a small dinner party that included both our families for the first time since the legal battle. Dad was quiet and respectful throughout the evening, asking thoughtful questions about our work and travels without offering unsolicited advice or criticism. Watching him interact with Marcus's parents was particularly revealing. He seemed genuinely interested in their perspectives and experiences, engaging in conversations rather than monologues. The man who had once dominated every family gathering was learning to participate as an equal rather than an authority figure. The evening wasn't perfect, there were still moments of tension and careful navigation around sensitive topics, but it felt like a genuine step forward. For the first time in years, I could envision a future where Dad was part of our lives, without being a threat to our autonomy. Mom had also benefited from the family therapy process, finding her own voice and establishing boundaries in her marriage. She'd started pursuing interests and friendships that Dad had previously discouraged, and their relationship seemed more balanced and respectful than it had been in decades. The experience taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to hold them accountable for their behavior, even when it's painful for everyone involved. The restraining order hadn't destroyed our family, it had forced us to confront unhealthy patterns and create new ways of relating to each other. Marcus and I celebrated our 3rd wedding anniversary with a renewal of vows ceremony in our backyard, surrounded by friends and family members who had supported us through the difficult early years of our marriage. Dad was there, reading a poem he'd written about the importance of letting children grow into their own lives and wisdom. As I looked around at our gathered loved ones, I realized that the crisis that had started with my father's arrest at our wedding had ultimately led to deeper, more authentic relationships throughout our family. The legal battle had been painful and necessary, but it had also created space for genuine healing and growth. The judge's gavel that had once felt like an ending had actually been a beginning, the start of learning how to love each other without control, how to support each other without manipulation, and how to build family relationships based on respect rather than fear. Sometimes the hardest thing about standing up for yourself isn't the confrontation itself, but learning to live with the freedom that follows. Building a life based on your own values and choices, rather than someone else's expectations, takes courage and persistence, but it's the only way to create relationships that truly honor who you are. 3 years later, when Marcus and I announced that we were expecting our first child, Dad's response was everything I could have hoped for. Instead of immediately offering advice or expressing opinions about our parenting plans, he simply said, "Congratulations, I'm so happy for you both, and I can't wait to meet my grandchild." That simple response, free from control or manipulation, showed me how much our relationship had truly changed. The man who had once tried to manage every aspect of my life was learning to celebrate my choices without feeling the need to direct them. It had taken a restraining order, a heart attack, and years of therapy to get there, but we'd finally found our way to a relationship built on love rather than control. Standing up to my father on my wedding day had been the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it had also been the most important. Sometimes you have to be willing to lose a relationship in order to save it, and sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone's destructive behavior. The legal papers that once felt like weapons of destruction had become tools of protection and healing. Judge Martinez's decision hadn't just enforced boundaries, it had created space for our family to learn healthier ways of loving each other. And in the end, that's what real family is supposed to do: help each other become the best versions of ourselves, not smaller versions of someone else's expectations. 5 years have passed since that life-changing wedding day, and I'm writing this while watching my 2-year-old daughter Emma play in our backyard, her laughter echoing off the desert landscape that has become our home. Marcus is grilling dinner while Dad sits on our patio, reading Emma a story about brave princesses who saved themselves. The scene would have been unimaginable during those dark months leading up to our wedding, but here we are, living proof that even the most damaged relationships can heal when people are willing to do the hard work of genuine change. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and there were setbacks along the way that tested everyone's commitment to building something better. About 6 months after we'd started family therapy, Dad had what Dr. Martinez called a regression episode. He'd been doing well in our sessions, acknowledging his controlling behavior, and practicing new ways of communicating, but something triggered his old patterns during a family barbecue at Marcus's parents' house. The incident started innocuously enough. Emma was just learning to walk, and she'd been toddling around the backyard, while the adults chatted and enjoyed the warm spring evening. When she stumbled and fell, skinning her knee on the concrete patio, I scooped her up to comfort her, while Marcus got the first aid kit. It was a typical toddler mishap that every parent deals with regularly. But Dad's reaction was anything but typical. He immediately launched into a lecture about proper child supervision, criticizing our decision to let Emma explore independently, and suggesting that we were being negligent parents. His voice carried that familiar tone of authority that had dominated my childhood, and I felt my stomach clench with recognition of the old patterns resurging. "Robert, she's fine," Carol Williams said gently, trying to diffuse the tension. "Children fall down all the time when they're learning to walk. That's how they develop coordination and confidence." Dad's response was swift and harsh. "That's exactly the kind of permissive attitude that leads to serious injuries. In my day, parents took responsibility for protecting their children, instead of letting them run wild." The familiar shame and anger began rising in my chest as Dad continued his critique of our parenting choices. Emma had stopped crying and was already squirming to get down and continue playing, but Dad seemed determined to turn a minor scrape into a major indictment of our family's values. Marcus stepped in with the calm, measured tone he'd perfected during our earlier conflicts. "Mr. Chen, we appreciate your concern, but Emma is perfectly safe. We're comfortable with our approach to letting her explore within reasonable boundaries." Dad's face flushed red, and I could see him struggling with the impulse to escalate the confrontation. "Don't tell me about reasonable boundaries, young man. I raised a daughter successfully, and I know what proper supervision looks like." The irony was staggering. Dad was criticizing our parenting, while simultaneously demonstrating the exact controlling behavior that
had nearly destroyed our relationship. I looked around at our gathered family and friends, seeing the uncomfortable expressions and awkward silence that his outburst had created. This was the moment I'd been dreading since we'd started rebuilding our relationship. Despite months of therapy and apparent progress, Dad was reverting to his old patterns of control and criticism. Part of me wanted to shut down and retreat to protect Emma and myself from his toxic behavior by cutting off contact again. But another part of me remembered Dr. Martinez's advice about setbacks being normal parts of the healing process. People don't change decades of ingrained behavior overnight, and real transformation requires patience, boundaries, and consistent consequences when old patterns resurface. "Dad, stop," I said firmly, standing up with Emma in my arms. "This is exactly the kind of behavior we've been working on in therapy. You're criticizing our parenting choices and trying to control a situation that doesn't require your intervention." Dad's mouth opened to argue, but I continued before he could speak. "If you can't respect our decisions as parents, then you need to leave. Emma doesn't need to be exposed to this kind of tension, and Marcus and I won't tolerate criticism disguised as concern." The backyard went completely silent except for Emma's babbling as she played with the buttons on my shirt. Dad stared at me with a mixture of shock and hurt, clearly not expecting me to confront his behavior so directly in front of our extended family. "Sarah, I'm just trying to help," he said, his voice softer but still defensive. "I have experience with raising children, and I don't want to see Emma get hurt." "Dad helping would be asking if we need anything or offering to get ice for her knee," I replied, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "What you did was criticize our parenting and create drama out of a normal childhood experience." Marcus moved to stand beside me, his presence a solid reminder that I wasn't facing this confrontation alone. "Mr. Chen, we understand you care about Emma's safety. but undermining our parenting decisions in front of family isn't helpful or appropriate. The next few minutes were tense as Dad struggled with his response. I could see him cycling through various emotions: anger at being challenged, hurt at being criticized, and what looked like genuine confusion about why his behavior was problematic. The old dad would have exploded into rage or stormed off dramatically, but the man who'd been working on himself in therapy seemed to be fighting those impulses. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dad's shoulders sagged slightly. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You're right, I was doing it again, wasn't I?" The controlling thing, the admission was simple but profound. For the first time, Dad had recognized his behavior in real time and apologized without making excuses or blaming external factors. It wasn't perfect, he still seemed confused about why his actions were problematic, but it was genuine progress. "Thank you for apologizing," I said, settling back into my chair while keeping Emma close. "This is hard for all of us, but Emma needs to grow up in an environment where her autonomy is respected, even as a toddler." The barbecue continued with careful conversation and conscious effort from everyone to rebuild the relaxed atmosphere. Dad spent the rest of the evening observing rather than directing, asking questions about Emma's development instead of offering unsolicited advice. When we said goodbye that night, he hugged us all and promised to discuss the incident with Dr. Martinez during his next individual session. That setback actually became a turning point in our healing process. Dad's ability to recognize his behavior and apologize in the moment showed that the therapy was creating real change, even if it wasn't linear or perfect. More importantly, it demonstrated to Emma that adults could disagree, make mistakes, and repair relationships through honest communication. Dr. Martinez used the incident as a teaching opportunity during our next family session, helping Dad understand the difference between offering support and imposing control. She introduced concepts about respecting children's autonomy and developmental needs that challenged Dad's traditional views about parental authority. "Robert, your instinct to protect Emma is natural and loving," Dr. Martinez explained. "But protection doesn't mean preventing all minor injuries or directing every aspect of her experience. Children need safe opportunities to explore, make mistakes, and learn from consequences." Dad struggled with these concepts initially, his military background and own authoritarian upbringing making it difficult to embrace what felt like permissive parenting. Martinez helped him understand the research about child development and healthy attachment. He began to see how his controlling tendencies could actually harm Emma's growth and confidence. The breakthrough came during a session where Dr. Martinez asked Dad to reflect on his own childhood experiences. He'd never talked much about his father, but during that session, he opened up about growing up with a man who ruled through fear and intimidation rather than love and guidance. "My father never explained his decisions or asked for my input about anything," Dad admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I swore I'd be different with Sarah, more involved and caring. But I think I went too far in the other direction, trying to control everything instead of trusting her judgment." That revelation led to deeper conversations about how trauma and dysfunction can perpetuate across generations, even when people have good intentions. Dad began to understand that his controlling behavior wasn't love expressed badly, it was fear and insecurity masquerading as protection. As Emma grew from a toddler into a preschooler, Dad had countless opportunities to practice new ways of relating to children. Instead of directing her play, he learned to follow her lead and engage with her imagination. Rather than correcting her attempts at independence, he celebrated her growing capabilities and problem-solving skills. The transformation was remarkable to witness. The man who had once micromanaged my every decision was learning to delight in Emma's autonomous spirit. He'd cheer when she figured out puzzle pieces on her own, laugh at her creative storytelling, and support her through frustrations without taking over her challenges. Marcus and I had deliberately chosen to raise Emma with the kind of respectful parenting we'd never experienced ourselves. We encouraged her questions, validated her emotions, and involved her in age-appropriate decision-making. Watching Dad learn to embrace these approaches felt like healing generational wounds that had affected our family for decades. The legal aspects of our situation evolved gradually as well. After 2 years of consistent progress in therapy and no violations of the modified restraining order, David Thompson helped us petition the court for complete removal of the legal restrictions. Judge Martinez reviewed our therapy reports and interviewed Dr. Martinez about our family's progress before agreeing to dissolve the order entirely. Walking out of that same courthouse where we'd battled for my safety felt completely different the second time. Instead of relief mixed with sadness, I felt hope and gratitude for the journey we'd taken to get there. Dad cried when I told him the news, not from self-pity or manipulation, but from genuine appreciation for the second chance he'd been given. The removal of the restraining order didn't mean our relationship returned to its previous patterns. The boundaries I'd learned to set remained in place, and Dad had developed genuine respect for them. He called before visiting, asked permission before offering advice, and gracefully accepted our decisions even when he disagreed with them. Emma's 4th birthday party became a celebration of how far our family had come. 3 generations of Chens and Williams gathered in our backyard, watching Emma blow out candles on a cake she'd helped design. Dad sat quietly at the children's table, listening to Emma explain the intricate rules of a game she'd invented, his face glowing with pride and delight. "Tell me more about the magic cookies," he said seriously, as if her 4-year-old fantasy about edible spells was the most important thing in the world. Watching him engage with Emma's imagination, without trying to correct or direct it, brought tears to my eyes. This was the grandfather I'd dreamed of for my children. It's someone who could enter their world with wonder rather than judgment, who celebrated their creativity rather than controlling it. Later that evening, after guests had gone home and Emma was asleep, Dad approached Marcus and me with something he'd been working on for weeks. He handed me a leather-bound journal, filled with his handwriting, explaining that he'd been documenting his journey through therapy and the lessons he'd learned about healthy relationships. "I want Emma to have this someday," he said, his voice uncertain. "Not now, obviously, but when she's older and can understand it. I want her to know that people can change, that making mistakes doesn't have to define you forever." The journal was remarkable, an honest, unflinching account of his controlling behavior, the pain it had caused our family, and his commitment to becoming a better father and grandfather. He'd written about specific incidents, analyzed his motivations, and outlined the strategies he'd learned for respecting other people's autonomy. But what moved me most were the letters he'd written to Emma throughout her early years, describing his hopes for her future and his commitment to supporting her dreams rather than directing them. He wrote about wanting her to grow up, knowing she was loved unconditionally, not for her compliance or achievements, but simply for being herself. "Dad, this is beautiful," I said, hugging him tightly. "Emma is lucky to have a grandfather who cares enough to do this kind of work on himself." As Emma started kindergarten, Dad found new ways to support our family that honored our parenting choices. He volunteered to help with school pickup when our schedules conflicted, but he never criticized the teachers or tried to interfere with Emma's educational experience. He offered to babysit during date nights, following our routines and rules without trying to impose his own ideas about bedtimes or activities. The most profound change was in how he handled disagreements with our parenting decisions. When Emma went through a phase of refusing to wear anything but superhero costumes to school, Dad's old self would have lectured us about appropriate dress codes and social expectations. The new Dad simply asked if there was anything he could do to support us through this developmental phase. "She's figuring out her identity and testing boundaries," he observed during one of Emma's particularly dramatic costume changes. "That's healthy, right? She's learning to express herself." His ability to frame Emma's challenging behaviors as normal development, rather than problems to be solved, showed how much his understanding of children had evolved. He'd learned to trust our judgment as parents, and to see Emma's strong will as a strength rather than a threat to authority. Mom's own transformation had been equally remarkable. Free from the stress of mediating between Dad and me, she'd blossomed into the grandmother she'd always wanted to be. She taught Emma to paint watercolors, shared stories about her own creative dreams, and modeled the kind of authentic self-expression that had been suppressed for decades in her marriage. The relationship between Mom and Dad had also improved dramatically as he'd learned to respect her autonomy and opinions. They'd started taking art classes together, with Dad learning to appreciate Mom's talents rather than dismissing them as impractical hobbies. Their marriage looked more like a partnership now, built on mutual respect rather than traditional hierarchies. When Emma turned 5, she announced that she wanted to have a feelings party instead of a traditional birthday celebration. The concept involved guests sharing emotions through art, music, and storytelling rather than focusing on gifts or entertainment. It was exactly the kind of creative, unconventional idea that would have horrified the old Dad. But the new dad embraced Emma's vision completely, helping her plan activities, and even volunteering to share a story about a time when he felt proud. Watching him participate in Emma's emotional creativity without trying to redirect or control it felt like witnessing a miracle. During his turn at the Feelings Circle, Dad told Emma and her friends about the day she was born and how proud he felt watching her parents love her so well. He talked about learning new ways to show love that didn't involve control, and how Emma had taught him that children are wise teachers if adults are willing to listen. Sometimes grown-ups have to learn new ways to love, he explained to the circle of 5-year-olds. And sometimes children are the best teachers for that. Emma beamed at her grandfather's words, completely unaware of the profound healing they represented. To her, this was simply who Grandpa Robert had always been, a man who listened to her ideas, celebrated her creativity, and trusted her to be herself. That evening, as Marcus and I cleaned up from the party, we reflected on the incredible journey our family had taken. 5 years ago, we'd been preparing for a legal battle that felt like it might destroy our family forever. Now we were raising a confident, creative daughter, surrounded by adults who respected her autonomy and supported her growth. Do you ever regret how everything happened? Marcus asked as we folded chairs and packed away decorations. I considered the question seriously. The legal battle had been traumatic and painful, creating wounds that had taken years to heal. But it had also forced conversations and changes that might never have happened otherwise. No, I said finally. I think we all needed that crisis to break the patterns that were hurting us. Emma is growing up in a completely different family culture because we were willing to fight for something better. Marcus nodded, pulling me into a hug as we surveyed our peaceful backyard. She'll never know what it feels like to have her choices constantly questioned or her autonomy threatened. That's the real victory. 6 months later, Dad made an announcement that surprised everyone. He decided to start volunteering with a local organization that provided support for families dealing with domestic violence and control issues. He wanted to use his experience in therapy to help other men recognize and change their own controlling behaviors. I can't undo the damage I caused, he explained during a family dinner. But maybe I can help prevent other families from going through what we did. There are a lot of men out there who think they're being protective when they're actually being controlling. His volunteer work became a passion that gave new meaning to his retirement years. He facilitated support groups for men working on anger and control issues, sharing his own story as an example of how change was possible with commitment and professional help. The feedback from participants was consistently positive, with many men expressing gratitude for his honest, non-judgmental approach to personal transformation. Emma, now 6 and starting first grade, had no idea that her grandfather was somewhat famous in Phoenix's therapeutic community for his dramatic transformation from controlling father to respectful family member. To her, he was simply the grandfather who brought art supplies to every visit, who listened to her elaborate explanations about playground politics, and who never told her she was too loud or too messy or too much. On Emma's 6th birthday, Dad presented her with a special gift that represented the culmination of his journey. He'd written and illustrated a children's book about a grandfather who learned to love his granddaughter by listening to her dreams instead of telling her what to dream. The story was simple but profound, following a grandfather who initially tried to teach his granddaughter proper ways to play and think, only to discover that her creative, unconventional approaches to life were actually wisdom he needed to learn. The illustrations, painted with Mom's help, showed the grandfather's face transforming from stern and controlling to open and delighted, as he learned to see the world through his granddaughter's eyes. Emma loved the book immediately, not understanding that it was essentially her grandfather's public apology and commitment to their relationship. She simply saw it as a wonderful story about a grandfather who learned to be brave enough to change. "Grandpa, this grandfather reminds me of you," she said innocently as Dad read the story aloud during her birthday celebration. "Really?" Dad asked, his voice thick with emotion. "What reminds you of me?" "He listens to the little girl's ideas and thinks they're good ideas," Emma explained matter-of-factly. "Just like you do with my ideas." The simple observation from a 6-year-old captured the essence of Dad's transformation better than any therapy report or legal document ever could. He'd learned to see Emma's ideas as good ideas, worthy of respect and consideration, regardless of their practicality or conventionality. As we approach Emma's 7th birthday, I find myself reflecting on the profound changes that crisis can create when people are willing to do the hard work of genuine transformation. The man who was once arrested at my wedding for violating a restraining order is now one of Emma's most trusted confidants, someone she turns to when she needs an adult who will listen without judgment. The legal battle that once felt like it might destroy our family actually saved it by forcing us to confront toxic patterns that had been damaging relationships for generations. Emma is growing up in a family that values autonomy, creativity, and mutual respect, gifts that will serve her throughout her life as she navigates her own relationships and challenges. Marcus and I often talk about the lessons we want to pass on to Emma about standing up for herself, setting healthy boundaries, and building relationships based on respect rather than control. We want her to understand that love doesn't require compliance, that healthy families support individual growth rather than demanding conformity. Most importantly, we want Emma to know that change is always possible for people who are willing to acknowledge their mistakes and commit to doing better. Her grandfather's transformation from controlling patriarch to respectful family member proves that even the most entrenched patterns can be broken with courage, commitment, and professional support. The judge's gavel that once represented the breaking point of our family ultimately became the catalyst for its healing. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their destructive behavior, even when that refusal feels like rejection or abandonment. Our story isn't unique. Families everywhere struggle with control, manipulation, and the generational transmission of unhealthy patterns. But it is hopeful, demonstrating that even the most damaged relationships can be rebuilt when people are willing to take responsibility for their actions and commit to genuine change. Looking at Emma playing in our backyard, secure in the knowledge that she's loved unconditionally and supported completely, I know that every difficult moment of our journey was worth it. She'll grow up knowing that her voice matters, that her choices are respected, and that the adults in her life see her as a complete person worthy of autonomy and dignity. The restraining order that once divided our family ultimately brought us closer together by creating space for authentic love to flourish. Sometimes you have to tear down broken structures before you can build something beautiful and lasting in their place. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give your children is the courage to break cycles of dysfunction, even when that breaking feels like destruction. Emma will inherit a legacy of respect, autonomy, and genuine love. Gifts that were forged in the fire of our family's crisis and tempered by years of commitment to doing better. The wedding day that began with my father's arrest ended up being the first day of our family's real healing. Sometimes the worst moments contain the seeds of the most beautiful transformations, if we're brave enough to plant them and patient enough to tend their growth. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.